The first Indigenous Australian elected to the House of Reps and appointed a minister, sworn in this week as the first Aboriginal person given the Indigenous Affairs portfolio. Please welcome our keynote speaker, Ken Wyatt.
Sorry. I think I'm feeling as emotional as I was on Sunday. Can I thank Dr. Richard Wally for your welcome to country? You're always incredible in the way in which you talk about the unity of all of us, but the importance of our culture and our way of life. In Noongar language, I say Kaya Wanju, hello and welcome. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to our elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the Governor of Western Australia, His Excellency Kim Beazley, Minister Simone McGurk, Police Commissioner Chris Dawson. What a fantastic initiative you've undertaken with the Police Department. It is so far removed from the days of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, and I thank you and acknowledge your contribution. Carol Innes and Gary Smith, co-chairs of Reconciliation WA, Karen Mundine, CEO of Reconciliation Australia, Glenn Kelly on the board of Reconciliation Australia, a good friend and colleague who has taught me much, former Aboriginal Affairs Minister Fred Chaney, Russell Gibbs, Chairman of the West Coast Eagles and Chief Executive of Hawaiian, Edgar Bastow, BHP Billiton's Asset President of the WA Iron Ore, Lisa Harvey, representing the Leader of the Opposition. Lisa was the one who talked me into going into politics. She cornered me at an event and asked me to get a real job. And because of that discussion, I've taken the journey that I have. Zara Fisher, Vice President of the HSE Group in Iron Ore, Nolan Hunter, CEO of Kimberley Land Council, all distinguished guests who are joining us today, but in particular, all of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people whose pathways have interacted with mine. For those of you who have been there and walked with me on so many issues over the last 4 decades, I thank you. I want to share with you Sunday. Anna and I we were just talking and Ben had tweeted a message about his father, Cedric, my cousin. And he was acknowledging Sorry Day. And then after we'd had that discussion about what Sorry Day would have meant to my mother, Anna asked a very pragmatic question. She told me to go and hang out the washing. So I took my phone with me. I had it in my pocket. And I was getting towards the end of the activity she'd given me and the phone rang. And I looked at it and I saw Scott Morrison had come up. And I thought, I've probably still got aged care. And he started by saying, I want to thank you for the work you've done in aged care and for Indigenous health. He said, you've got a big heart and it's a good heart. I would like you to become the Minister for Indigenous Australians. And because we had been talking about Sorry Day, all my emotions welled and I couldn't answer him. He heard 2 sort of gasps. And it took me about 2 minutes before I said, yes, Prime Minister, because I realised what he was asking. I realised the implications of the journey that I would take over the next 3 years in leading and walking with not only our people, but fellow Australians whose passions and commitments are to improving outcomes. But what an amazing gathering. And it does warm my heart to see more than 1,350 people gathered here today, this morning, to celebrate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and contributions. to celebrate our deep past and enduring presence across this great state and our vast country. What a privilege that I've been made the first Aboriginal Minister for Indigenous Australians during National Reconciliation Week. This morning I want to reflect on how far we've come on that journey of reconciliation, how I got here with a bit of my own story, and how far we've come as a nation. Any of us old enough to remember the 50s and 60s will tell you it's a long, long way. In 1952, I was born at Roland's Mission prematurely. I am the eldest of 10 children. My father was a railway ganger. My mother was a member of the Stolen Generation. In those days, they had to get permission to marry, permission to travel, and they could be arrested if they were out after 6 p.m. and not back on the designated sites, which were commonly referred to as Aboriginal reserves. If the Department of Native Welfare came around and thought you weren't providing good care, they could take your children away. We moved to a tiny town called Nanine, just 26 miles west of Meekatharra. My first schooling was by correspondence, working with a radio with a foot pedal, like an old sewing machine, for 2 hours at a time. Soon afterwards, my parents moved to Corrigan. At that point, my life changed. And it's no exaggeration to say I'm standing here today because of my parents' dedication to our family and their commitment to going to school and getting an education. And that started with my Year 1 teacher, Miss Abernethy. She saw that I was behind the other children, so she asked me to come to school half an hour earlier every day. When I was at home with whooping cough, she came over every afternoon to bring lessons and reading books so I could keep up. To me, that epitomises walking together and wanting to make sure that the outcome is far better than what it would have been. She believed in me, supported me, and never gave up on me. And 50 years later, she even campaigned for me in the seat of Hasluck. While she was building my confidence and my vocabulary, there was a petition being circulated to have us moved out of the town. But people refused to sign the petition. What they said is they need to be given a go. They need the opportunity to be part of our community. And so the petition failed because the townspeople wanted us to stay. And just a few years later, Australia voted overwhelmingly for the inclusion in the 1967 referendum. I was in high school in Perth, and Fremantle had the second highest yes vote in the nation. Things were changing. We were making progress. For the first time, we had a sense as Australians we were indeed walking together. 4 years later, Neville Bonner became the first Aboriginal person in Parliament as a Senator for Queensland. The next year, in 1972, saw the creation of the first Department of Aboriginal Affairs, the precursor to the new agency I will now lead. In the mid-70s, the Commonwealth Government introduced the Racial Discrimination Act and the Aboriginal Lands Rights Act. These were landmark reforms that opened the way for every move towards rights and equalities that have followed. In fact, between the 60s and 90s, the law of the land has changed so much. And in the decades since, I have seen with you a significant cultural shift in our thinking. The reconciliation movement and the work Senator Pat Dodson and many others did all those years ago has driven a great deal of that change. It started small, but its ripple effect outwards has been tremendous. It has an incredible impact not only at the local level, but in the way in which large corporates have embraced it and undertaken commitments in reconciliation action plans that would have been unthinkable 25 years ago. I believe it's been one of the major social reforms driven by ordinary Australians and Indigenous people walking together in our country. Its impact shows up in Reconciliations Australia's recurring study. Every 2 years since 2008, the Australian Reconciliation Barometer has measured attitudes and perceptions towards reconciliation on 5 overlapping dimensions: race relations, equality and equity, institutional integrity, unity and historical acceptance, truth-telling. What the latest study shows is that the overwhelming majority of Australians believe that the linkages between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians are important, and that knowing our history and truth-telling are vital to this relationship. 80% of Australians support a formal truth-telling process, and 86% believe it's important to learn our shared history. Still more encouraging is that 95% of people agree it's important Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have a say in the matters that affect them. This echoes the yes of the 1967 referendum, and it resonates with my appointment as Minister for Indigenous Australians. The days of complete control by the police or the bureaucracy over Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lives are long gone, but there is still much more to be done. Since those days, we've travelled more or less steadily towards greater freedom, autonomy and equality. And crucially, we have travelled together. As I said after my swearing in this week, policy won't be made in my office. It'll be made in conjunction with Indigenous Australians at all levels, from the ground upwards and through the various representative bodies that have been established, but importantly, with all of those who are key stakeholders. I believe that it's only through genuine partnerships and working together that we will solve our problems. We need to jettison forever the historic mindset of our people as passive recipients of services and programs. We need instead partnerships based on mutual respect, mutual resolve and mutual responsibility. Indigenous Australians must truly be regarded as equal and active partners, involved and informed. One of my priorities in this role is working on refreshing the Closing the Gap framework. As the Prime Minister Scott Morrison said earlier this year, the original Closing the Gap process was good-hearted and well-intentioned, but it took a top-down approach, not one based on true partnership. It failed on its own merits. In refreshing that approach, we now have an opportunity to do things differently, to do things in a genuine partnership. We've established a partnership with a coalition of peak organisations and a joint council through COAG. But of course, the key is partnering with people on the ground so that they can drive local, community-led solutions. And though the approach has changed, the heart and soul of Closing the Gap has not. We want to see Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children getting the best start in life, the same opportunities, schooling, healthcare, and the outcomes as peers. As well as Closing the Gap, we remain committed to recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution. We will continue to work with Indigenous communities to design a model for constitutional change that reflects their needs and aspirations, and we will hold a referendum once we've settled on the right model. This is a long-term process, and we need to get it right. If we don't, we risk putting this issue on hold for another 30 or 40 years, and Noel Pearson and I are in one accord with that. In keeping with the Australian Reconciliation Barometer finding that a majority of Australians support learning about the past and undertaking a formal truth-telling process, we've committed to work on that with Indigenous communities. And as part of that process, we will support the establishment of a national resting place. For more than 150 years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ancestral remains were removed from country and placed in museums, universities and private collections in Australia and overseas. The National Resting Place will be a central place for commemoration, reflection and healing, a place of ancestral remains to rest in honour and peace where all Australians can celebrate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. In all the work, we will be partners, walking together with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Looking back across this shared journey, my own and much of the larger story of reconciliation, I can see the progress we've made. Barriers and barbs in life do not become bollards. The primary school teacher who told me I should leave school and get a job because nobody would employ me as an adult was a bollard but not a barrier. The birthday party where a number of invited children didn't come to that event because I was there. The comments and emails I got when I was running in Hasluck just 10 years ago and not back to the 50s. But those aren't the stories that have shaped my life. Like many of you in this room today, you have had similar experiences and challenges, but you are all sitting here at tables as equals to other Australians who have the same shared journey and same shared vision. Those things scar you, and of course they do, but they don't define you. I apply the same lens to our larger journey of reconciliation. Yes, we acknowledge the suffering and the wounds. Indeed, we can't go forward unless we tell the truth about the past. But every step we take, every progression we make is because of hope. It's because of optimism, because we choose trust over distrust and courage over fear. As I said at the beginning of this Reconciliation Week, we must ensure the greatest of our many nations is reflected in the greatness of our Australian nation, now and forever. I believe with all my heart that the only way forward is together. I have seen the power and strength of sitting together, of listening and walking together, and of walking and working together, grounded in truth, walking in courage. As we say in the traditional Nyungar of the country on which we are meeting, Nyun Mort, Nyala Mort, Nyun Budja, Nyala Budja, meaning my people, our people. My country, our country. That's the reason we've come so far. As all of us, as leaders, we will all walk together and not behind or ahead. That's the force that will take us forward. And I thank Reconciliation Australia and every one of you in this room for the journey that we've undertaken thus far with reconciliation and the way in which your genuine commitments and efforts have brought together all in a way that unifies us in having visions and aspirations for a better future for all of our children and those who come after us. I thank you for the privilege of today.